live of the day. I actually went live earlier on, but there was an issue with the sound and the vision being synced up. In other words, it wasn't in sync, and also the signal seemed to come and go, so it was pretty glitchy. Hence, I thought I'd give it another shot. So here we are live, and I wanted to follow up on a video that I posted within the last 48 hours. I can't remember exactly when, and it was the second one in which I was going over the subject, the area of reacting, or more specifically overreacting. And overreacting is an issue that certainly I have faced over the years. You may well have done also. And overreacting is understandable in many situations. Overreacting is also something that I think is potentially harmful for us ultimately. And because of that, I thought it might be useful to really explore what overreacting could mean. And one of the things that I did in the first of the two-part episodes of the podcast was to look at what are sometimes called cognitive distortions, but I think it's more useful to really consider them to be thinking traps or perception traps, because those perception traps and thinking traps are basically, well, literally that, the traps, things that can trip us up, things that can cause us to not function or not think correctly. And one of them was jumping to conclusions. And you'll be aware that if you jump to conclusions, sometimes you jump in the wrong direction. You reach the wrong conclusion. And certainly I've done that over several years. I've jumped to the wrong conclusion about many different things. And I used to joke with a group of friends of mine who were in a high IQ society. It may have been Mensa. And I said to them, one definition of someone with a high IQ is the ability to jump to the wrong conclusion more quickly than other people. And whilst that's not necessarily true at all, the point being that we're all prone to it, or at least we're all capable of it. We're all capable of jumping to the wrong conclusion. Another thinking trap or perception trap is catastrophizing. You've probably heard about that before. So one thing goes wrong and everything is wrong. You know, an example that I've used before is if you're on holiday, if we're on holiday and the hotel doesn't provide a hot breakfast, it's just some kind of cold buffet thing that you pick up. Now, that wouldn't bother me at all, not remotely. But let's imagine that it did. And let's imagine that I said, well, that's the holiday ruined. And I allowed the lack of this hot breakfast in this hotel to make me feel absolutely ghastly, to make me think that everything was ruined, to make me forget about all the other things that were available during that holiday, on that vacation, within that resort or wherever it may be. And whilst I haven't done that, I have done things when I get upset enough about something. And I can then get into that catastrophizing. You know, the holiday's a catastrophe. Everything is broken. Everything is a mess. It's all wrong, or it's all terrible. And maybe you found yourself in that zone as well. And what I would suggest there is that, yes, there is a trigger. There's a trigger which can cause us to get into that catastrophizing or awfulizing zone. But there's something that we do internally that can allow that thought to overpower everything. And that type of thinking, that type of emotional thinking, when we do things like catastrophizing, is what I want to talk about. It's not necessarily all negative, but it's useful at times to be aware of the negatives, to consider what we may end up doing in terms of our reaction to some trigger, whatever that may be, and also what we may end up then doing in terms of how we interact with individuals, how we communicate in a situation, how we, of course, think about that situation. And so that leads us on to emotional thinking and what that might be. Well, I think it's useful to consider that, as I mentioned in the most recent video that I posted, there are several different thoughts about emotions and how we process them and what that means. And the bottom line, having run through a few of them within that video, is that there is no real consensus. There is no real consensus about what is the mechanism by which we experience emotions. I think it's fair to say that a lot of researchers would agree that there are physical sensations, but how we interpret those physical sensations is a matter of some debate. Some researchers say, well, we feel the sensation, like let's say racing heart, bit of trembling, adrenaline, and then we label it as fear. But some people suggest that we could label it differently, and there is evidence to suggest that the labeling process is important. So if we're led to believe in experimental conditions that racing heart, that slight trembling is because of excitement, then we can label those same physiological feelings as a good thing rather than being scared a bad thing. But again, that's not all that is in the picture, because if you imagine that you've been feeling fear, then I certainly have found this situation where I'm fearful, I'm scared, but my heart isn't necessarily racing. It may have sped up a little bit, but sometimes it hasn't, and I'm certainly not trembling. And I have no recognition, no knowledge of feeling something physical and then labeling it. Now, again, these researchers would suggest that, well, that's got to do with the fact it may be automatic. I think a lot of stuff is automatic. It may indeed be the case that you cannot separate out the sensations of the body and how we interpret them from those interpretations. Other researchers suggest both things happen simultaneously. We're aware of how we're feeling and we're aware of the label that we've given it, but not consciously giving it that label, that emotion. And then you get on to neuroscience, and most people have heard of the amygdala, but the amygdala is mainly implicated in the processing of fear. And yet it's involved in other emotional processes and processing as well. But let's say primarily fear. And if we process fear in some way through the amygdala, how do we then know that it is fear? How do we then know that, well, what I'm afraid of is that dark shadow over there? And by the same token, how do we not think? How do we just do something in that fight or flight reaction where we suddenly find ourselves running, or we shout or scream and turn and run, or talking about occipital load. We're not talking about the Brodmann areas and so on, or parts of the prefrontal cortex. It's quite simple. It essentially suggests that we have our higher thought processes. And in the triune brain, that's considered to be towards the top. And in the middle, the limbic system. And the limbic system is a catch-all for emotional processing. Because there are different parts of the brain, it is suggested that are involved in different elements of emotional processing. So once more, I'm neatly stepping around, deliberately so, exactly how that happens, because we don't actually know at this point in time. We're not really quite sure what gives us the ability to know what an emotion is. But I'm pretty certain it is connected to where our attention goes, our memory is involved, how we label it linguistically, how we feel physically, and maybe other things, but also that interplay between these different areas of the brain and how they interact. So a triune brain, simple and inaccurate as it is, I believe is a really useful way to consider how we think with a view to, well, thinking more about how we think and maybe doing some things differently and not overreacting. So triune brain, let me get I think I've got the diagram here. I wasn't going to use it, but seeing as how we're all here. So there it is. There's this triune brain model. And yeah, you can see that the right way around. So basically up here is the neocortex. Down here, there is the limbic, and here is fight or flight. So if you just imagine that, so 3 levels, so to speak. Neocortex, our ability to think rationally, to look at the bigger picture, to think more widely, to think in ways that are perhaps quite exquisite in terms of problem solving. So the neocortex is responsible for the railway and the train engine that pulls the carriages that you're sitting in, the airplane, the mobile phone, our ability to do this right now. That neocortex helped people, helped the population, humans, to, well, construct all that they've constructed, both good and bad. And that neocortex also allows us to problem solve in a different way from the ways that I'm going to talk about shortly. And that neocortex allows us to learn language and also to do what you're doing right now, which is, I hope, to understand what I'm saying. It allows us to learn other languages and so on. So a pretty sophisticated piece of machinery. But then we have that middle section, that of that triune brain, that limbic part, which is this catch-all for emotions. And that emotional processing, those areas, yes, we could get into a bit of detail, and I did in the video that I made before, but in some ways, for the moment at least, that's not useful for us, because if we want to figure out the implications of that limbic system and what we could do differently, then it is sometimes, as I'm going to do right now, better to consider it as being emotional processing, just the area where emotions are processed. So then, of course, as you would see from that little sketch, we have the fight or flight area, often brainstem, basic processes. And the idea is that when we get into fight or flight, it is about survival. And pretty much that's what it is. So then what I'd like you to do is to imagine that we see something. Let's say it's a snake on the ground. And what we can do is we can logically look at that snake and we can say, in this part of the world, with that coloration, that snake is not poisonous. Or it is poisonous, but only if you go near it and stand on it is it likely to bite. So we can do that. But let's just say that you are in an area where snakes are extremely poisonous and you are on alert for these snakes and you're worried about going near one and you see something in the corner. Then what's likely to happen? It's unlikely that you will say, aha, that is the squiggly, wiggly, red and green, big-fanged, one bite and you're in serious trouble snake. In other words, you're not going to spend any particular length of time labeling it. You're going to say to yourself, hold on a second, this thing could kill me. And you're straight into fight or flight. You've got to go. You've got to save yourself. Another example would be that you step off the pavement. Let's say it's in London, and you step off the pavement and you turn around, and there's a huge double-decker bus heading towards you. You generally don't stop and go, hold on a second, that's one of those old style double deckers, like the one that was in the movie with Cliff Richard. No, you tend to, without bothering to think about that, jump back onto the pavement and go, my goodness. And as the bus disappears and your respiration returns more back to normal, you may say to yourself, I was almost knocked down by a bus that looks very similar to the one that Cliff Richard drove in that movie, Summer Holiday. But you're likely to not say that at the time. It would be unlikely because the fight or flight reflex, if I want to call it that, reaction is there to save your life. And we see this time and time and time again. A real simple example, put your hand on a hot stove, you don't realize it's hot, you draw it away immediately. That's without conscious thought as often as not. If you think about what you were thinking about, you may find that you didn't think about it at all until after you had thought when you didn't think. In other words, you put your hand away and you go, yike, that stove was hot, but the pulling away, it's like there's a short circuit because it's got to be rapid. And I guess this is the point I'm coming to. It has got to be rapid. It's got to be fast. It's got to save us. So we don't want to spend time putting up information and processing in that neocortex because it would take too long. We would be in trouble if we were trying to process our fight or flight reactions in the neocortex. So it happens more rapidly. Now, again, I'm going to talk in broad conceptual terms. One way to imagine that is that the information comes in. So the information comes in from our senses, collected as often as not by the thalamus, and then goes to various parts of the brain. This information comes in about what is around us. And let's say in this instance, it is what we see. And we see the snake. We see this double-decker bus. Maybe we hear it as well, of course. But let's just say we see it. And then something's got to happen, hasn't it? We have to process that somehow. In some part of the brain, and I would suggest in that limbic system, we have to understand whether this thing, this snake, this bus is dangerous. And if it is a life or death situation, that button has got to be pressed to fire off fight or flight, to take us straight out of there. So not only are we not particularly processing emotions at that point in time, we're just acting. And it might be, of course, yes, I understand, fear and anger could be there, those basic emotions, but there's nothing subtle about it. And it's very, very fast. It's got to be fast because it's got to save our lives. So the signal comes in, got to be processed somewhere. Let's say it's in the limbic system. Let's say the amygdala is involved, and somebody in that area is basically pressing the big red alarm button. You know, danger, Will Robinson, and boom, straight down to fight or flight. So we have adrenaline, cortisol, eyesight changing, digestion shut down in due course, but pretty quickly. But we're going to move. We're going to react instantaneously, pretty much, without much thought. But also, as I've suggested, without much going on emotionally beyond the basic, anger, fear, get out of here. Or, as the case may be, to defend. That could happen. So, essentially, then I think what we need to look at is the emotional processing itself. So if we talk about the neocortex, as I've mentioned, if we suggest, as I've suggested, or as I suggest, that it is to do with problem solving, and it is an area of the brain that in different ways can allow us to overcome and solve different puzzles, different challenges in life, with creativity, with lateral thinking, with ingenuity. So that's going on there, and that's good. But also in the mix, we have emotions, and those emotions are really important. Those emotions help fill in much more of the picture. So if we imagine that when we, well, in fact, you imagine, there's a good coaching strategy. When you think of someone that you know, let's say it is your best friend. If you conjure up their name and their face, then that best friend comes with a feeling, don't they? Don't they come with a feeling? That best friend, they come with something. There's like, oh yeah, John, yeah, yeah. Or that friend that you had a laugh with the last time you were out, a real laugh. It was really funny, and you then remember that friend, but also that situation. You might start laughing. That memory comes with a feeling. That remembering, that imagining of that friend comes with a feeling. And those emotions are attached always. Sometimes they are neutral, but there is an attachment process to a memory, to a situation that allows us more information about that situation, that allows us to understand more at a base level, friend or foe, danger or opportunity. Then consider someone who you don't like. Let's say it's an enemy, a frenemy, someone who has done you wrong recently. Imagine that individual, imagine that person. And then you might be able to picture them in your mind. Even the name of them may cause something to happen. Maybe it happens with the name and the image if you can conjure the image. And that is, of course, a feeling. And that feeling could be one of annoyance. That feeling could be one of, oh, oh, anger, irritation, disgust, just revulsion, or more neutral, but I don't want to go near them again. And so the emotions are there to protect us, to give us more information. We need to know if this person, this situation is something that we should run away from or run towards. We need to know whether it's a threat or an opportunity. We need to know socially where someone is going to help us or hinder us. Someone wants to give us a hug or perhaps wants to harm us. We need that information. We need to feel it in the moment. We need to remember it and to then recall that memory when we're in a similar situation. And of course, that can go wrong, and that would be part of the thinking, perception traps. But let's stick with that, because I want to paint the picture of how important emotions are. And there are some conditions where people, well, if you imagine the limbic system, that's got to communicate with the neocortex. I would argue. I mean, it has, but let's give it a bit of debate in there, because people have debated it. The consensus is that it's got to communicate, and I think that's true. We've got to link up those more logical thoughts with feelings somehow. And one way to imagine it, and I'm just suggesting imagining, I'm not saying this is the exact process, is that a signal is sent from the limbic part of the brain, that mid part of the brain, to the neocortex. And one way to consider that is it's like a label. So a label is sent from the emotional center or centers to the logic center or centers, so that we can get a more rounded picture. Again, I talked about language as being in the neocortex, generally speaking. But that's also not the full picture either. But let's keep it simple, because I want to maintain that thread about emotions. So let's then say that our higher thought processes are enhanced by information from the limbic system. So signals have to go to those higher thought processing areas. As I've suggested, think of it as a label, but everything that comes in then needs a label. Every bit of information, by and large, needs an emotional label. And if that label says this is life or death, then it's fight or flight. The alarm, big red alarm button is pressed, and boom, adrenaline, cortisol is surging, and we're defending ourselves or getting out of there. We've got to do that. It's inbuilt for most of us. But when these other labels go up with that more information, like be wary of that person, I'm uncomfortable, they're not nice, they lied to us the last time, that comes with not only the knowledge of the lie, but the feeling of the lie. And we need to know about that feeling because it makes us pay attention. It allows us to construct what we may or may not do in terms of a response. However, some people in some situations, due to insult to the brain, do not get that information. The signals, it would seem, containing the label, the emotional content, doesn't reach the higher thought processing areas. And that can cause strange things to happen. Not fun things to happen for the people to whom it happens, but observing it, reading about it, strange things. Now, I did read about one particular example. I mean, I've read about more than one, but one that's stuck in my mind. And I actually haven't looked up the core bit of research. So this could be apocryphal, and apologies, but I think it's also in the spirit of this model that I'm talking about, this triune model, that it is an example. It's an example. It's a way of considering how important and intertwined the emotions are. So essentially, this person had no communication, it would seem, between the emotional center and the centers for higher thought processing. And then this person, who was a patient, had a visit from his parents. And initially, he said they were imposters. And people tried to figure out what that was. What was this imposter thing? What did this individual mean? And as I recall reading the story, it would seem that although the individual recognized these people as potentially looking like his parents, even, with photographs to show him and his parents, was still doubting that although these people who were visiting looked like the parents in the photograph, they must be imposters. And one explanation appears to have been that this was the rational mind trying to give a rational explanation for this off-beam, off-center experience that the individual, the patient, was feeling when he looked at these individuals. In other words, there was no sense of love, connection, or whatever else was there that was happening subconsciously, or I should say that was normally there that may have happened subconsciously. Like, oh wow, a warm glow, love, affection, the need to go forward and give them a hug. That was missing. And because it was missing, the logical brain apparently was saying, how do we make sense of this? There's something way off here. I don't know what it is. I don't know what's missing because I wasn't really consciously aware of those feelings coming up in the past. But here's a logical explanation. Those people are imposters. Now, again, I want to go back and double check a few more of those stories, but I think it's a fair illustration. I think what the story tells us and highlights is that emotions are intrinsically linked, and I think that's the key. And then we can move on to the next little part, which is that emotions, this emotional signaling from the limbic, the emotional processing centers, to the higher thought processing areas, that signaling can overpower. Those labels can become so charged, if you will, that they kind of, it's almost like a switch. It's almost as if the The ability to think in a subtle way is doused down. That the label says, hey, this is really important. It may be fight or flight, but but it may not be. And in the example I'm going to use here, it isn't. So this is not fight or flight, but it's a strong emotion. And it's as if that strong emotional label, when it is sent up to that executive suite, somehow causes it to get weighted down. It's almost like a dimmer switch. Maybe the label has got weight to it. That could be a good way to think about it. Yeah, we'll just hang that there. And that label of emotion pulls that little switch down, which douses down our ability to think more subtly, more widely, in a balanced way, to consider all the outcomes, all the options, and indeed very often the repercussions of any action or decision that we're about to make or take. So if you think about it, you will spend a lot of time under normal circumstances wondering whether you should do something that you're uncertain about. And when you begin to think along those lines, I think it's fair to say that it's likely you think, well, if I do that and do it that way, so-and-so might get upset. Or if I do that and do it this way, well, maybe that isn't strictly legal and I don't want to do that. And then I would feel bad. And then I would be breaking all sorts of rules and regulations. So we begin to parse out the future and also consider various timelines based on separate actions that we may take. And we've all done that, and we all do that. But emotional thinking, those emotional labels, when another way to consider it is when that limbic system begins to get really active, then that more emotional type thinking kicks in. And that emotional type thinking is more tribal. It is more basic. It can be, of course, triggered into fight or flight, but as I've said before, I want to stick with the emotional thinking, able to not necessarily attack or run away, but our thinking is much more basic. It is much more rudimentary. It is less subtle. It is less nuanced. And that emotional thinking, when we catastrophize, for example, well, that's it. It's emotional thinking. We're not attacking the cold buffet or running away from it. I mean, maybe we could, like Basil Fawlty attacking his car. That was kind of emotional thinking, to say the least. We're not doing that, but that emotional thinking becomes pervasive potentially. It becomes like a mist or a haze that through which we look at things. It's distorting reality. We're not thinking clearly. We're looking at it through this haze, this fog, this mist. And it can make, therefore, our consideration of events, people, much more basic, much more black and white. Tribal, them and us, right and wrong. And when we think in a more tribal them and us way, by and large, we're right and they're wrong. The ability to look at it from someone else's perspective, which is crucial, I think more and more these days, is diminished. It is reduced. Our ability to look at other people and find things in common is diminished. It is reduced. Our ability to find empathy when those emotions are strong along the, let's say, negative part of the spectrum, like anger, hate, jealousy, etc., fear as well. It's harder to find things that we can empathize with others about. They become the other. They are them. They are the people who are perhaps different from us. We dehumanize those other people because they're not in our tribe. And that them and us, that black and white thinking, that right and wrong thinking, remember, we're going to be right, they're going to be wrong, is emotional thinking. It may ultimately be correct. Well, let's put that in just to make sure that I'm not leaving out things here. It may be correct, but very often it is so rudimentary that it isn't entirely correct. And also, quite often, it is so rudimentary, it is wrong because we were not thinking clearly. We're not thinking about consequences. So when we get angry, when we get fearful, when we get irritated, when we get jealous, when we get spiteful, then what are we doing? We're not thinking often about, if I do this, that'll happen. And if I do that, that will happen. It's more reduced than that. is boiled down to, I'm going to do that. And maybe we do have a couple of options, but they're pretty crude. There's nothing sophisticated about it. And we're often also not thinking about those consequences that I've mentioned. We're also not thinking about the other people involved, directly or indirectly, as having feelings, as being people that we should care about. Instead, that whole tribal thing kicking in is a recipe for conflict. It's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for a huge lack of understanding. It is a recipe for all sorts of things going wrong because of it. And none of this means that I'm suggesting we shouldn't be fearful from things that are dangerous, that we shouldn't be ready and have to, if there's no other option, defend ourselves. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when we're locked in to that highly charged emotional thinking, particularly when it is on the negative, as I've called it, end of the spectrum, then all sorts of bad things can happen, particularly when the others are also looking at us as the others from them. We are the them, they are the us to them, if that makes sense. So those factions that can evolve then become these tribes that split and can't see eye to eye, and they won't see eye to eye until those emotions subside, until they begin to look at the other people and humanize them, to be aware of their plight, to find ways to say, hey, they're pretty much just like us. We really need to find things in common. And I know that's a hackneyed phrase, and I know that it's been overused, but I have to use it because I think that is important for us to do, to find those things in common, to look at one another, and rather than judge each other on those fake, as I would call them, differences, like how we look, how we sound, how we dress, to look instead, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, at the character of each other. I think that's what he meant. Look at the character. And looking at the character, then we can see this is another person. This is an individual with hopes and fears and many things in common. But we're focusing on the difference. We're focusing on those things that can drive us apart. Also, I would have to say in the mix, that there are people out there who are bad, who seek to harm, and they may actually seem very similar, but we need to look at their character and think, oh, hold on a second, they're not of good character. They're a wolf in sheep's clothing. We also have people who are different from us who want to harm. But we've got to not presume that in the first instance unless there is irrefutable evidence to the contrary. We have to instead, I believe, really get more used to sitting down and understanding that we have differences. We need to approach situations more and more and more where we go into a situation forearmed with the knowledge that someone has a different perspective on life, that someone has a different perspective on what the outcome should be, that has a different perspective on potentially values. But knowing that we're going to have a discussion with such an individual can allow us to manage our own emotions before we get there and during the time that we're there. I say, hey, I know there's going to be differences, and that's okay, because that's why we're here. And within those differences, let's then see what we can find in common. And an important thing to add into the mix is within those differences, what we can do is we can seek the truth. We can find out what that truth is. And if more people were just aware that strong emotions can dumb us down, strong emotions can get in the way of finding empathy, of finding things in common, and attempting to allow those emotions to dissipate to a degree or put them aside and to sit down recognizing there will be differences, but also with a joint quest for truth, that no matter where it leads us, let's find out what the truth is. And the truth could be the solution to this problem. The way that we can solve this is by doing that. That's the truth that we're after. But that truth can be many things. But if the truth is masked, obscured, and in many ways hidden by just not recognizing that another individual, another group may have things that we could benefit from, then we won't get there, and we'll continue to have these lines of division everywhere. It would seem these days, more and more sometimes it would seem. And so when those emotions get strong, they basically hijack our ability to think in a more measured, reasonable, calm, and considered way. And as I've suggested, it, as often as not, reduces our ability to problem solve. And if we're into that tribal thinking, them and us, it almost certainly reduces our ability to look at that other group geographically, that other group ideologically, and find out what we can do to work together. And so more and more and more, when we look around, and I think there's all sorts of reasons for it. I think the internet, I think social media, I think bad actors in some of the media, I think some of the spin, etc. It is designed to hook us in emotionally. It's designed, of course, to hook us in and addict us through the constant scroll for dopamine, or at least an anticipatory dopamine causing us to scroll, and then the quest for novelty to allow us to keep there. But within those spheres, within those platforms, there are messages, and you and I know that when we look at something, the algorithms go, you're interested in that, let me show more of that. So if you're doing that in a situation where there are strong emotions involved from you, from me, from others, then we're easier to trap, because we're looking for, hey, I really dislike so-and-so, or I really love this group. Then the algorithm will feed you more of that. And you never get the alternative. You never get the other perspective. And without that other perspective, we don't have the full picture, even if we disagree with it. It's like sitting down with those other people, that other individual. I know we've differences, but let's try and uncover what the truth is here. And those algorithms, in many ways, well, they just want you there. They'll do whatever it takes to keep you there. So what you may be being fed is simply something that's going to trap you ultimately into an echo chamber. That's what it's going to be, because you're hearing and seeing more of the same. And before you know it, you'll think, well, everybody thinks that way. And then occasionally a little voice from over here goes, well, there's another way to think about that. Oh, no, there's not. You are the them. We are the us. You're wrong. We're right. Can you see how that would go? Can you see how we're vulnerable to that online? And also our attention spans, it would seem, are shrinking. So our ability to sit back, meditate, consider, think through, debate, read properly, read in depth, have an in-depth, elongated conversation with someone. All of that, not in every area, I'm glad to say, but all of that is under threat. It is being reduced. It is being diminished. Consider then politicians, all of them I'm talking about here, all of the politicians. They are aware that they need good rhetoric. They are aware that they need to capture your attention. They are aware that a punchline, a strapline, a logo, colours, these are primal things. You'll respond to them. They're aware they're getting you to chant in unison. Well, that's tribal as well. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. I'm not judging. I'm saying they are aware. But they're also aware that the way to get you hooked in is by emotion. Again, that can be good and bad. If we have politicians who are noble, who are honest, who are upright, who are forthright, who are decent, who are caring, who are empathic, who want to do the right thing, who don't want to obfuscate, who are there ultimately to serve, and this applies to all leaders as well. If we have people like that, and their message is what it appears to be, and they use strategies to access people's emotions, the hearts and minds, then it's understandable. But if we have politicians, and I'm talking about globally here, if we have politicians who know this, some rule by fear, of course, but if we have politicians who know this and who are also interested in well, obfuscating things and being less than truthful and using emotional leverage, then they also can hook people in. And you could argue, what politician can you trust these days? What leader can you trust? I don't know. I don't have a list, but I'm genuinely a bit skeptical, just as a starting point. And that's why I talk about substance over style. Look at the substance of what they're saying. But most of us can't escape it, whether we like it or not, that we are influenced by how someone looks, how they sound, the sequence of language that they use, how they tell a story, how many parts the story is in, what keywords they use, the use of repetition, and so on. And as long as we are truly aligned with that, if that is truly what we believe, and I also think if it is truthful, it is honest, it is decent, that's important, it is caring, then it's great. You can enjoy the journey. You can enjoy following this leader, this individual, whomsoever it is, in whatever party. The issue that we have these days is that there is an awful lot that isn't entirely well upfront. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, as you might imagine that it would do. And so it's up to each and every one of us to be as critical in our thinking as possible. Because when we allow emotions to overpower, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to making mistakes in personal life and business, and certainly socially as well. We're vulnerable to being over-trusting. We're vulnerable to being complacent. We're vulnerable to being frightened into doing things. We're vulnerable to being so angry or so anxious that we say and do the wrong things, or we follow someone inappropriately who's playing us like the Pied Piper. And so that ability to step back in oh so many ways is important. To step back and say to ourselves, okay, what is the big picture? And I mentioned in one of the videos that naming emotions can be really useful. Also, just being aware of it. Just consider the emotions that you have during any one given day. Consider a journal. Write things down as you go along. Write what is triggering you. Write what you felt. Practice meditation. That's really useful as well. Mindfulness meditation. You get more used to seeing those thoughts coming in, often with less of an emotional sting, because you can also kind of observe the emotion. What is that thought doing that just came in there? Oh, I'm just going to let that go. And when you do notice a feeling, an emotion, normally somewhere in your body, you can get fascinated by it. You can step back from it a bit and go, oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. There's that thing happening. And then I would suggest thinking about the overall goal that you want in this situation, perhaps the immediate goal or the long-term one. So at the moment, I don't want to fall out with this individual, so I'm going to walk away. Or long-term, I want to be seen as someone who can get into these situations and not get dragged into it. I'm not going to go into some tit for tat type thing. And also, I think that knowing that you may be overpowered is crucial. Knowing that the emotions, if they creep up, will cause you to potentially not think as well, think as clearly, and to react rather than respond. I've talked about responding before. In my world, responding means that you choose the reaction. Because it's not then a reaction, it's a response. You choose what you're going to say. You choose your behavior. You choose your action. You choose who to follow in a considered and balanced manner. Now, that can't always happen, and I'm certainly not an adept at that in the sense that I'm someone who gets it right all the time. I get it wrong, and I get it wrong consistently because I'm flawed, but I get it wrong a lot less. It's a work in progress, but it's heading in the right direction. So I name the emotion. Research suggests that can help. Not all research, but most of it. That can help. Naming it. What is it doing? It's allowing us to think from that neocortical area, those higher thought processing areas. We name it and we go, oh, it's that. And then I'll think, what is happening in this moment in time? What is happening right now? oh yeah, this person's angry. Do I want to get angry? I don't want to get angry. What do I want? I want to keep cool. I want to extract myself. I don't want to exacerbate the situation. Or longer term, as I've said, I want to be someone who can remain cool in a crisis. Again, I'm making that up. Have a think about what your longer term goal would be. Who is the ideal you, for example? How would they act in those situations? And in that moment, you can say to yourself, what would the ideal me do? Or indeed, think about someone you admire, fictional or real, alive or dead. What would they do in this situation? And some of that thinking, again, higher thought processes, can be enough to allow us to step back from the emotion before it overpowers. Breathing, getting for a walk, of course, that can all help. But as often as not, you've got to do that after the event. I'm talking about right in that moment. But if you can do a bit of breathing, there's all sorts of breathing exercises out there that can also help reduce the sting. And so more and more and more, what we have to do is to, as I've suggested, think more critically, to consider the far bigger picture, because otherwise our emotions, not only will they hijack our ability to think more widely and more subtly and to problem solve in a more nuanced way and perhaps very smart way. Not only will we hijack ourselves, but we ourselves become hijacked if we allow those forces from outside that want us to think emotionally or more emotionally to take over. What is it they say in Ireland? There's a great phrase, be wise. Be wise to all that. Be wise to the fact that you've much more control over your own emotions. And control is a wrong word, ultimately. It's to manage them, to regulate them. We can become emotionally dysregulated, but we can become emotionally regulating of ourselves. Not all the time, not in every situation. And I appreciate the a lack of sleep. I talked about sleep in that last video, because when we lack sleep, we're generally more emotional. I certainly am. When we're in a situation where we are perhaps also maybe having to take some stuff to help us out with whatever it may be, some medication, let's put it that way around, that can change how we think and how we feel and how we are. And also, of course, we may have things going on in our lives that makes us more emotional. And that doesn't mean to say that we can't override things by stepping away and allowing the emotion to diminish, but it means that we've got to be more aware of the fact that we could be more prone, more easily triggered. And as I've said, we all probably still will be from time to time. The idea is to reduce it. The idea is to diminish it. And I'll begin to wind this up, but by sort of finishing off and pointing in a cryptic way to the emotional temperature in the US right now. And I really hope that the people in charge are going to use language and action to help people just allow some of this stuff to dissipate, to step away from the brink, to step away from this combative language and the othering of people and the diminishment of groups, parties, individuals, because it is so dangerous. And at the moment, it looks like there's such a chasm that never the twain shall meet. Well, we do have people in the media who are leaders over there, obviously politicians and business leaders. And I think that they need to start doing a heck of a lot more to be seen to work together. Because right now, that is so dangerous. I have been really unsettled by recent events, and it is not the way to even consider solving anything whatsoever. And I understand, of course, the emotions at play. Not that I'm in that country. I don't mean that. I don't understand it in detail, but I understand how strong emotions make us think, because I've experienced them, of course. And if you think, okay, can emotions change? Do we, Do they dissipate? Well, they do through time. Some people suggest get out of the situation. If you cannot control it and you've gone over that tipping point and your emotions are in free fall, but you've got enough cognition left to realize that you're now in that quagmire, that these emotions are really beginning to diminish your ability to think clearly, you're angry, you're irritated, you want to verbally lash out, then get out of there. Get it. If you're already in anger, use the need to move to walk away and go and get some fresh air and stay away for a while. Absolute minimum of 20 minutes, probably longer. And if you're trying to convince someone who's in, again, I'll use the example, anger, to see your perspective, forget it. Forget it. Ain't going to happen, because they're in that this fire of emotions, and it singes the circuitry of those higher thought processes, that neocortex. It trips the switches, the dimmer switches come down, and they're not thinking like that. You are the other at that point in time. You are wrong. They are right. And you're not going to convince them, not when that emotional charge is fizzing around the brain, around their system. And the best thing there is to just get away from them as well. So when you feel that you are overpowered by emotions, if you possibly can, get away, go for a walk. If you're trying to convince someone who's quite patently I use the example of anger, because I think it's the quickest way to get this idea across. So if they're angry, get away from them. And maybe you should get away from them anyway, but trying to convince them, trying to use logic in a situation like that, you know this because you probably already tried it. Doesn't work, does it? Doesn't work well. But when people calm down, then you can begin to talk. But be careful, because sometimes they aren't totally calmed down and they can begin to flare up again all of a sudden, because that charge hasn't dissipated. It was just glowing slightly in the corner. So we've got to be aware of that. But the idea of emotions is also interesting, in the sense that I've talked about these emotions diminishing. But there's an old story, and it's one of those ones which probably happened to somebody somewhere, and I can't say for sure. And certainly in retelling is no doubt apocryphal to a degree. But here's an old story I got told a while ago to demonstrate this. And it is that you're on a train, and the train is fairly busy, but there's a family on the train, and there are some kids running riot. They're flicking hats off people and pushing newspapers if someone's reading one of the sort of free physical newspapers that are giving out. They're shouting, they're drumming on windows, etc. And people are looking around and looking at who's obviously the parent, because the kids have been interacting. The parent, say that seems to be the father, stares ahead and doesn't say anything at all. And you think, what kind of father are you? What are you doing? What do you experience? Irritation, annoyance. Get these kids under control, maybe even anger. And let's say you storm across to this parent and say, excuse me, sir, but could you get your kids under control? They're causing absolute chaos on this train. Can you not see this? Now, you may have guessed what's going to happen next in this story. And this parent looks up at you and says, oh, are they? I'm really sorry. We've just come from the hospital. Their mother, my wife, she's gone. And what happens to your anger in that moment? Now, I know some people joke and say, well, I'm even angrier. How dare he not control the kids? Probably it dissipates. It evaporates like steam from a kettle. And that's so it's what about managing emotion regulation rather than control. Control implies constriction, restriction, pushing something together, causing even more pressure in a confined or more confined area. Dissipate is the way. And so the law of dominant emotions at work. Now let's finish off with a different story then. this isn't something that anybody's told me, but maybe you've experienced it. But I'd like you to imagine that you're driving a car and someone cuts you up, and nothing has actually happened, but you're really annoyed, and you think I shouldn't do this, but you're overpowered by those emotions, so you jump out of the car and you storm across, and then some guy gets out of the driver's side and stands up and up and up and up. You think, oh, he's quite tall. Not only tall, he's very, very wide. And most of the size of him, it would seem, is muscle. And he's also got like a t-shirt on, Fight Club, UFC, heavyweight champion, or whatever. Is your anger more or less likely to dissipate in that situation? And I would suggest probably you find yourself going, yeah, it doesn't matter. My mistake, because another survival instinct has taken hold. Now, you could be angry enough that you approach this individual. And of course, again, road rage is unfortunately a perfect example of where people aren't remotely thinking at all. But anyway, in terms of our UFC fighter, it's highly unlikely. It would probably be not a good idea to get engaged with them, and it's not a good idea to get involved in that road rage stuff. But I can see how people do it. I do understand it. I remember years ago looking at a vehicle that was trying to get through a gap, and it was a huge lorry, and this car is like edging in front, and the lorry driver's having none of it. And the car is against like a barrier, like one of the barriers on the road, on the highway, freeway, motorway. And the lorry, well, it was a standoff, and they're both heading to this point where the road narrowed. And ultimately, the lorry driver kept on going, and the car got kind of squished a bit, like scraped along the barrier. Now, they were going slowly, and the car wasn't getting compressed that it would have damaged the driver in any way. But neither of them gave way. And you would have thought the guy in the car would have looked at the big lorry and thought, well, he's just not giving way. There's several tons there of vehicle that's a lot bigger and a lot heavier than mine. And maybe I should just stop what I'm doing and give up on this, and perhaps write a sharp note to the driver next Wednesday using a quill and a bit of paper. But no, that wasn't the thought process at all. It was into this total emotional thinking. And you could argue that, yeah, to be fair, that was fight or flight. And I'd suggest that it was. But its close cousin, overpowering emotions, where we're not fighting and we're not flighting, is where many of us can overreact, and where many of us need to pay attention, need to get more attuned to our emotions, the emotional landscape of our thoughts, of our interactions, of our thinking, which is emotionally impacted, and also to ultimately, I think, this is going to potentially sound cheesy, but I think it's so important to say, we've got to be kinder to other people. And we've got to be ultimately kinder to ourselves, because we won't always get that right. And when we get it wrong, well, let's not go into a rage with ourselves. To say, how do we do this more differently next time? And how can I look at people and humanize them and be kind to them and empathic? Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you find it interesting. If you have any questions, comments, etc., let me know. And I guess I better go. That's been quite a while we've been on, more than I planned. But if you've stuck with it, thank you very much. For the moment, from me, bye for now. I think I turn this off that way. Yeah, there we go. Okay.